December 15, 1944. And Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, 53 years old, commander of Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, sat in his underground command post 17 meters beneath volcanic rock calculating the mathematics of a battle he knew he would lose, 23,000 Japanese soldiers against 70,000 Americans who would assault the island. 3-1 numerical inferiority that would become 5-1 or 10-1 as American reinforcements arrived, supported by naval gunfire from battleships and airstrikes from carriers that Japan couldn't contest, and Kuribayashi, who'd studied in America, who'd served as military attaché in Washington, who understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese officers, knew that Iwo Jima couldn't be held, couldn't be reinforced, couldn't be evacuated, could only be defended until every defender died, and the only question wasn't whether Japan would lose Iwo Jima, but how long 23,000 soldiers could delay 70,000 Americans and how many American casualties that delay would cost. Kuribayashi had calculated the exchange ratio Japan needed to justify the battle. If each Japanese soldier killed 10 Americans before dying, 23,000 Japanese deaths would cause 230,000 American casualties, would make Iwo Jima so costly that American public opinion might force negotiated peace rather than invasion of Japan, would demonstrate that conquering Japanese home islands would cost millions of American lives making atomic weapons or negotiated settlement preferable to conventional invasion, and Kuribayashi's defensive strategy was designed not to win the battle. Winning was impossible, but to maximize American casualties, to make victory so expensive that Americans would reconsider whether defeating Japan was worth the price. But Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had initially ordered conventional defense, beach defenses, immediate counterattacks, banzai charges, the tactics that had failed on every Pacific island since Guadalcanal, and Kuribayashi, who understood American firepower superiority, had refused these orders, had argued that beach defenses would be destroyed by naval bombardment before Americans landed, that banzai charges would be massacred by American automatic weapons, that conventional tactics would result in rapid defeat with minimal American casualties, and Kuribayashi had convinced Tokyo to authorize revolutionary defensive strategy: no beach defenses, no banzai charges, no wasteful counterattacks. Instead, a defense in depth using underground fortifications where Japanese soldiers would survive American bombardment, would ambush American forces after they landed, would exact maximum casualties through attrition rather than theatrical gestures. The specific defensive preparations showed Kuribayashi's understanding of what modern firepower required. Japanese forces had spent 8 months excavating 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting defensive positions, had built 1,600 pillboxes in bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, had positioned artillery in caves where naval gunfire couldn't reach them, had stockpiled ammunition and supplies to support prolonged defense, and the underground fortress system meant Japanese defenders could survive bombardment that would destroy surface defenses, could reoccupy positions after Americans advanced past them, could create defense that had no front lines, but was everywhere and nowhere, and this tactical innovation represented evolution of Japanese defensive doctrine from suicidal courage to calculated attrition. Kuribayashi had written to his family knowing he wouldn't survive: "Do not expect my return, I will fight to the end on Iwo Jima. I hope my death will contribute to Japan's final victory, though I fear victory is impossible. The Americans are too strong and we are too weak. But we will make them pay for every meter of this island, and perhaps that payment will spare Japan worse suffering." And Kuribayashi's resignation to death combined with determination to inflict maximum casualties characterized Japanese defensive psychology at Iwo Jima, characterized acceptance that survival was impossible, but sacrifice could have meaning, characterized final evolution of Japanese military culture from believing victory was possible to knowing defeat was certain, but making defeat expensive. American intelligence estimated Iwo Jima would fall in 5 days. The Marine Corps had taken Tarawa in 3 days, Saipan in 25 days, Peleliu in 73 days. But that was considered anomaly, and the 5-day estimate reflected American confidence that superior firepower and numerical advantage would overwhelm Japanese defenders quickly. But intelligence didn't understand that Kuribayashi had transformed Iwo Jima from conventional island fortress into underground labyrinth where every cave and tunnel would require Americans to root out defenders with flamethrowers and explosives, where artillery spotters positioned on Mount Suribachi could direct fire on landing beaches throughout the battle, where Japanese soldiers ordered to kill 10 Americans each would follow those orders even when it meant certain death, and American intelligence failure to anticipate Kuribayashi's defensive innovation would cost 6,800 American lives over 36 days of combat, more brutal than any previous Pacific battle. January 1945. And Captain Toshio Iwatani, combat engineer, conducted final inspection of the underground fortress system that 8 months of Japanese labor had created. 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,600 defensive positions, excavated through volcanic rock using hand tools and explosives because mechanized equipment couldn't be landed on Iwo Jima, ventilated through shafts that prevented smoke buildup from cooking fires and weapons discharge, reinforced with timber and concrete where geology required it, and stocked with ammunition and food and water to support 8-week siege. And Iwatani, who'd supervised construction, understood that these tunnels represented revolution in defensive warfare, represented adaptation to American firepower superiority that made surface defenses suicidal, represented Japanese engineering capability that would make Iwo Jima's conquest cost Americans more casualties per square mile than any previous Pacific battle. The tunnel system had 3 distinct levels. Shallow tunnels at 5 to 10 meters depth connected frontline positions and allowed rapid reinforcement. Medium tunnels at 15 to 20 meters depth housed artillery positions and ammunition storage protected from naval gunfire. Deep tunnels at 25 to 30 meters depth contained command posts and hospitals and living quarters that could survive direct hits from battleship shells, and this layered defense meant American forces would need to fight through multiple defensive lines even after capturing surface positions, would need to clear tunnels level by level using tactics that infantry training hadn't prepared them for, would suffer casualties from defenders who could retreat through tunnels then reappear behind American lines. Major Yoshitaka Hori, logistics officer, had calculated supply requirements for prolonged defense. 23,000 soldiers consuming minimal rations would require 400 tons of food for 8 weeks, artillery and machine guns would consume 2,000 tons of ammunition during expected battle duration, medical supplies and water would require additional 300 tons, and Hori, who'd organized these supplies, understood that stockpiling eliminated Japanese vulnerability to American naval interdiction, eliminated the logistics failures that had doomed Japanese garrisons on other islands, meant Iwo Jima garrison could fight until killed rather than until supplies ran out. The defensive position showed tactical sophistication. Pillboxes constructed with 6-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls could withstand direct hits from tank guns, firing apertures positioned to create crossfire zones where Americans would be caught between multiple Japanese positions. Artillery pieces mounted in caves with steel doors that opened for firing then closed, preventing American counter-battery fire. Machine gun positions dug into reverse slopes invisible to American naval observers, and these positions reflected Kuribayashi's understanding that surviving American preliminary bombardment was more important than firing at American landing craft, that patience would be rewarded when American infantry advanced into prepared killing zones. But the most innovative defensive element was interconnectivity. Tunnels connected positions, allowing defenders to shift forces without exposing themselves to American fire, allowed Japanese soldiers to evacuate positions under bombardment then reoccupy them after bombardment ceased, allowed wounded to be evacuated to underground hospitals without becoming casualties during evacuation. And this mobility within static defensive system meant Americans couldn't fix Japanese positions, couldn't prevent reinforcement, couldn't isolate defensive strongpoints, and the frustration of destroying Japanese positions only to find them reoccupied hours later would characterize American experience throughout the battle. Colonel Tadashi Takaishi, artillery commander, positioned his guns to maximize effectiveness despite American counter-battery fire. Heavy artillery in caves on Mount Suribachi could hit landing beaches throughout the battle. Medium artillery dispersed throughout the island could support defensive positions anywhere. Light mortars positioned in tunnels could fire then displace before American forces located them. And this dispersed artillery system meant American naval gunfire couldn't suppress Japanese artillery, couldn't prevent Japanese guns from inflicting casualties on American forces throughout the battle, couldn't achieve the fire superiority that conventional doctrine assumed. At 0900 hours on February 19, 1945, the first wave of 30,000 Marines from 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches, expecting the devastating defensive fire that had characterized every Pacific landing since Guadalcanal. But the beaches were silent, no artillery fire, no machine gun fire, no mortars, and Lieutenant James Bradley, platoon commander with 28th Marines, hitting the beach prepared to die, found instead volcanic ash that made walking difficult and eerie silence that was more terrifying than enemy fire because Marines knew Japanese defenders were watching them land, were allowing them to advance inland, were waiting until beaches were crowded with men and equipment before opening fire, and Bradley, who'd landed on Saipan, understood that this unopposed landing meant Japanese had learned from previous defeats, meant conventional beach defense had been abandoned for something worse. Kuribayashi watched American forces land from his command post, monitored reports from observation posts describing Marine units advancing inland, calculated the optimal moment to open fire when beaches were crowded with personnel and supplies, creating targets that Japanese artillery couldn't miss, and at 1000 hours, 1 hour after 1st Marines landed, Kuribayashi ordered his artillery to commence firing, and suddenly the silent beaches erupted with Japanese shells landing among Marines who'd thought the landing was unopposed, and the psychology of being allowed to land safely then coming under devastating fire was more demoralizing than immediate opposition would have been, because it demonstrated Japanese tactical sophistication that Marines hadn't anticipated. The volcanic ash terrain was nightmare for infantry operations. Black sand absorbed energy from every footstep, making movement exhausting. Vehicles bogged down, requiring Marines to push them manually. Foxholes collapsed as Marines tried to dig defensive positions, and the combination of difficult terrain and Japanese fire from concealed positions created chaos where Marines couldn't advance quickly or dig in effectively. Where they were exposed on open beaches under artillery fire, they couldn't locate, and casualties mounted as Japanese gunners hit targets systematically while Marines couldn't identify where defensive fire originated. Sergeant Michael Strank, squad leader with 28th Marines, led his squad inland from the beach toward Mount Suribachi, receiving sporadic fire from positions his squad couldn't locate. We'd take fire from a pillbox, call in artillery or tanks to destroy it, watch as shells hit the position, advance, and find the position empty because Japanese had retreated through tunnels. Then we'd take fire from behind us from the same position we'd just neutralized, and we realized we were fighting enemy who could appear and disappear, who weren't fixed in positions we could destroy, who were using tunnels to create defense that had no front line, and Strank's tactical assessment was shared by Marines throughout the landing force, who discovered conventional infantry tactics were insufficient against defensive system that violated doctrinal assumptions. By nightfall of D-Day, 30,000 Marines were ashore, had secured beachhead 3,000 meters wide and 1,000 meters deep, had suffered 2,400 casualties, 8% of landing force, and the casualty rate on first day exceeded planners' expectations for entire battle. And Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding V Amphibious Corps, understood that intelligence estimates of 5-day battle were catastrophically wrong, that Kuribayashi's defense was unlike anything Marines had encountered, that Iwo Jima would be prolonged battle requiring tactics and equipment that Marines would have to develop under fire. The Japanese defensive success on D-Day validated Kuribayashi's strategy, allowing Americans to land unopposed, concentrated them in killing zones, withholding fire until optimal moment maximized surprise and casualties, using underground positions prevented American firepower from suppressing defenses, and the first day's casualties proved that each Japanese soldier defending from prepared positions could inflict far more casualties than Japanese soldiers conducting banzai charges, proved that Kuribayashi's calculated attrition strategy was working exactly as planned. February 20th through February 23rd, and 28th Marines assaulted Mount Suribachi, the 550-foot volcanic cone dominating Iwo Jima's southern tip, and Sergeant Strength's squad advanced meter by meter against Japanese defenders who'd transformed Suribachi into fortress with caves and tunnels and pillboxes covering every approach, and the fighting required tactics Marines had to improvise. Flamethrower teams would approach pillboxes under covering fire, spray burning fuel through firing apertures, wait while Japanese defenders died or fled, then demolition teams would seal the position with explosives, and this brutal close-quarters combat was repeated hundreds of times as Marines reduced Suribachi's defenses position by position, and the casualty rate was catastrophic. 28th Marines suffered 900 casualties taking Suribachi, 30% of the regiment. But the psychological importance of capturing Suribachi justified the cost because Japanese artillery observers on Suribachi directed fire throughout the beachhead, making Suribachi's capture essential to landing force survival. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding 2nd Battalion 28th Marines, coordinated the assault using combined arms tactics that would become doctrine for reducing fortified positions. Infantry would locate Japanese positions and mark them with colored smoke, Sherman tanks would fire point-blank into firing apertures, flamethrower teams would burn out survivors, demolition teams would seal positions permanently, and this systematic approach consumed time and ammunition and produced casualties. But was the only method that worked against positions designed to survive conventional assault, and Johnson, who'd been wounded twice during Suribachi assault, continued commanding because leadership continuity was essential when tactics were being developed under combat conditions. February 23rd, and Marines reached Suribachi's summit, raised American flag that photographer Joe Rosenthal captured in image that would become most famous photograph of World War II, and the flag raising represented symbolic victory. Americans controlled Suribachi's heights. But tactical reality was that Japanese defenders still occupied tunnels throughout Suribachi, still emerged at night to attack Marine positions, still required weeks of cave-by-cave clearing that continued after Suribachi was declared secured, and the gap between symbolic victory and tactical completion illustrated Iwo Jima's character, where nothing was truly captured, where Japanese defenders fought from positions Americans thought they'd cleared days earlier. Private First Class Ira Hayes, one of the flag raisers, participated in combat that continued around Suribachi for days after flag raising. People saw the photograph and thought the battle was won, thought capturing Suribachi meant Iwo Jima was ours. But we were still fighting, still dying. Japanese were still in the tunnels under our positions, would come out at night and attack us, and I watched friends die after the flag was raised, died taking positions we thought were secure. And the photograph that made us famous was just one moment in battle that continued for weeks. The cost of Suribachi was representative of Iwo Jima's broader battle. For days to capture 550-foot volcanic cone using 3 battalions supported by tanks and artillery and naval gunfire, 900 Marines killed or wounded, approximately 1,000 Japanese killed. And this exchange ratio of nearly 1-to-1 was far worse than previous Pacific battles where American casualties were typically 1/5 of Japanese casualties, and the ratio proved Kuribayashi's defensive strategy was working, proved that underground fortifications and no-retreat orders created defensive effectiveness that Japanese forces hadn't achieved earlier in the war. If you want to see why Kuribayashi's defense made Iwo Jima the costliest battle in Marine Corps history, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories of Pacific War tactical evolution. And please subscribe if you haven't already. But Suribachi was only the beginning. The main Japanese defensive zone lay north of Suribachi in terrain more rugged and more heavily fortified, and Marines who'd spent 4 days taking Suribachi would spend 32 more days fighting across 7 square kilometers that Kuribayashi had transformed into killing ground, where every crater and ravine concealed Japanese defenders, where progress was measured in meters per day rather than kilometers, where American casualties would eventually exceed 26,000 and Japanese casualties would approach 100%. February 24 through March 16, and 3 Marine Divisions, 4th, 5th, and 3rd Marine Division, which landed on D+1 as reinforcements, ground forward through Iwo Jima's central highlands, where Kuribayashi had concentrated his main defensive positions, and every geological feature had been transformed into fortress, ravines with caves holding artillery pieces, ridges with interlocking pillboxes, plateaus honeycombed with tunnels, and the defensive system had no rear area, no safe zones, no positions where Marines could rest without being under fire, and the psychological strain of continuous combat where death could come from any direction at any moment tested Marine endurance more severely than any previous battle. Captain Robert Dunlap, company commander with 26th Marines, described the tactical frustration of fighting enemy that couldn't be seen. We'd call in airstrikes against suspected positions, watch as bombs hit, advance and find positions unoccupied because Japanese had retreated through tunnels, then we'd take casualties from the same positions hours later, and we realized that conventional supporting fires weren't working, that we needed to get into the tunnels and kill defenders face to face. But tunnel fighting was horrific, dark confined spaces where you couldn't see enemy until you were close enough to touch him, where grenades and flamethrowers were only weapons that worked, where psychological terror was worse than combat in open. The specific tactical challenges were unprecedented. Marines couldn't bypass Japanese positions because bypassed positions would attack from rear, couldn't suppress positions with artillery because Japanese artillery was in caves, couldn't use tanks effectively because terrain was too broken, and the only tactic that worked was methodical reduction using infantry with flamethrowers and demolitions supported by tanks and artillery firing directly at visible targets, and this slow systematic approach meant Marine advance was measured in tens of meters daily when doctrine called for advancing kilometers, meant the battle consumed time and casualties at rates that exceeded planners' worst estimates. Lieutenant John Keith Wells, tank platoon commander, coordinated infantry-tank cooperation that became essential for progress. Infantry would locate Japanese positions and mark them for us. We'd maneuver tanks to firing positions and hit pillboxes with 75mm shells. Then infantry with flamethrowers would assault while we provided covering fire. And this coordination was all improvised. We hadn't trained for this kind of fighting, hadn't expected defenses this sophisticated. But Marines adapted, developed tactics under fire, and that adaptation was why we eventually won. The winning took 5 weeks longer than anyone predicted. The casualty rate was unsustainable. Marines were losing 1,000 casualties daily during main defensive zone fighting, approximately 5% of combat strength per day, and if this rate had continued, the entire landing force would have been casualties before battle ended. But Marines kept fighting because Iwo Jima was strategically essential for supporting B-29 bomber operations against Japan, because the battle couldn't be abandoned without admitting defeat, because Marine culture demanded that once committed Marines would complete the mission regardless of cost, and this determination to continue despite casualties characterized Marine Corps ethos that value mission accomplishment over casualty avoidance. Kuribayashi monitored American progress and adjusted his defense. When Marines concentrated forces for breakthrough attempts, Japanese artillery would hit concentrated formations causing mass casualties. When Marines dispersed to reduce casualties, Japanese infiltrators would attack isolated units, and this adaptive defense prevented Marines from developing consistent tactics, prevented predictable patterns that Marines could exploit, and Kuribayashi's active defense management from his command post showed that Japanese defense wasn't static fortification, but was dynamic system that responded to American tactics. March 1, 1945. 10 days into the battle, and Navy Lieutenant Commander James Pierce, battalion surgeon with 27th Marines, triaged wounded Marines at Forward Aid Station 500 meters behind the front lines, and Pierce, who'd treated combat casualties throughout the Pacific Campaign, had never seen casualty flow this sustained. 20 to 30 wounded arrived hourly, requiring immediate treatment. Wounds were predominantly from artillery and mortar fragments because Japanese defensive fires were more intense than previous battles. Many casualties required amputation or surgery that couldn't be performed at aid station, requiring evacuation to hospital ships offshore, and Pierce, working 18-hour days, understood that Iwo Jima was producing casualties at rate that medical system was barely handling. That if battle continued at this intensity, the 3 Marine divisions would be combat ineffective within weeks from casualties alone. The specific casualty statistics were staggering. By March 1, 10 days after landing, approximately 8,000 Marines had been killed or wounded, 27% of landing force, and at this rate the entire landing force would be casualties before battle ended. And division commanders who monitored casualty reports understood they were fighting battle of attrition, where American numerical superiority was being consumed by Japanese defensive effectiveness, and the calculation became whether American replacements could arrive faster than casualties accumulated, whether Marine Corps could sustain operations at this casualty rate, whether strategic importance of Iwo Jima justified losses that exceeded all previous Pacific battles. Navy corpsman John Bradley, whose son would write best-selling book about Iwo Jima, treated wounded Marines under fire throughout the battle, crawled through Japanese fire to reach wounded, administered morphine and bandages and words of comfort to men who were dying, and Bradley, who'd volunteered as corpsman believing he'd save lives, found that Iwo Jima produced casualties faster than corpsmen could treat them, that many wounded died waiting for treatment, that medical resources were overwhelmed by casualty flow that never stopped, and Bradley's experience characterized the medical crisis that accompanied tactical crisis. Marines could take ground, but were paying price in casualties that raised questions about whether victory was worth cost. The categories of wounds reflected Japanese defensive tactics. 70% of casualties were from artillery or mortar fragments because Japanese indirect fire dominated the battlefield, 15% from small arms fire during close quarters combat, 10% from mines and booby traps that Japanese had planted throughout defensive zones, 5% from flamethrower backpack explosions and tank casualties, and the wound patterns showed that Japanese artillery that Americans couldn't suppress was killing Marines more effectively than small arms fire, that indirect fire superiority gave defenders advantage that American firepower superiority couldn't overcome when targets were underground and invisible. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas, who'd earned Medal of Honor throwing himself on grenade to save fellow Marines, spent weeks recovering from wounds at hospital ship offshore. I watched as landing craft brought wounded from beach to ship, watched as surgeons operated continuously trying to save Marines, watched as bodies were buried at sea when surgeons couldn't save them, and the scale of casualties was shocking. Every landing craft brought dozens of wounded, operations never stopped, burial details worked daily, and I understood that Iwo Jima was different from other battles. The Japanese defense was killing Marines at rate we'd never experienced, and I wondered if we'd win before casualties made winning impossible. The psychological casualties were significant though less documented. Marines who'd fought for weeks without break developed combat fatigue that rendered them unable to function, developed thousand-yard stare that characterized men who'd seen too much death, developed emotional numbness that prevented them from caring whether they lived or died, and these psychological casualties didn't appear in casualty statistics, but degraded combat effectiveness just as physical wounds did. And division psychiatrists who examined combat-fatigued Marines estimated that 30% of men who served on Iwo Jima suffered psychological damage that would affect them for life. The replacement system struggled to compensate for casualties. Marine Corps shipped 6,000 replacements to Iwo Jima during battle to replace casualties. But replacements were often insufficiently trained, hadn't developed unit cohesion with Marines they were joining, died at higher rates than veterans because they lacked combat experience, and the replacement flow barely kept pace with casualty flow. barely maintained division strength at levels needed to continue operations, and commanders understood they were consuming Marine Corps' combat strength at rate that couldn't be sustained beyond Iwo Jima. By battle's end on March 26, 3 Marine divisions had suffered 26,000 total casualties, 6,821 killed in action, 19,217 wounded, 2,648 requiring evacuation for combat fatigue, and these numbers represented 37% of landing force. More than 1 in 3 Marines who landed became casualties, and the casualty rate exceeded any previous Marine Corps battle. Exceeded casualties from much larger battles like Okinawa when calculated as percentage of forces engaged, and the human cost of Iwo Jima raised questions about whether small volcanic island was worth thousands of American lives. March 16, 1945. 26 days after landing, and American forces reached northern tip of Iwo Jima, having pushed Japanese forces into final defensive pocket approximately 1 square kilometer in area, and General Kuribayashi sent final radio message to Imperial General Headquarters. Battle situation has come to last moment. I apologize for failing to defend the island. Our forces will make last attack tonight. May my death inspire final victory. And Kuribayashi, who'd commanded the defense brilliantly, who'd maximized American casualties through tactical innovation, who'd prolonged battle for 26 days when intelligence predicted 5 days, now prepared for final stand not through traditional banzai charge, but through continued resistance from remaining defensive positions, because even at the end Kuribayashi maintained tactical discipline that had made his defense so effective. The surviving Japanese garrison was approximately 3,000 soldiers. 87% of original garrison were already dead, and these survivors were wounded, starving, without medical supplies or reinforcement or hope of relief. But they continued fighting because Kuribayashi's orders specified no surrender, specified that each soldier would continue fighting until killed, specified that dying while inflicting casualties was acceptable while dying without fighting was shameful. And this psychology of mandatory resistance regardless of military futility characterized Japanese military culture that viewed surrender as dishonor worse than death. Captain Samaji Inoue, one of Kuribayashi's staff officers, described final days in memoir written after surviving the war. We knew defeat was certain, knew we would die. But General Kuribayashi maintained discipline and tactical coordination until the end, continued organizing defensive fires and counterattacks, continued planning how to inflict maximum American casualties with minimal remaining forces, and his leadership prevented collapse into chaotic last stand, maintained effective resistance until American firepower overwhelmed our positions, and even in defeat we inflicted casualties that proved Japanese soldiers following proper tactics could fight effectively against overwhelming force. March 17 through March 26, Marines reduced final Japanese pocket through systematic application of overwhelming firepower. Artillery fired thousands of shells daily. Sherman tanks operated in teams providing direct fire support. Flamethrower teams cleared caves one by one, and the destruction was total. Entire square kilometer of terrain was cratered and burned and obliterated. But Japanese resistance continued from underground positions that survived bombardment, continued from wounded soldiers who crawled from caves to attack Americans, continued until literally every defender was killed and Marines could advance without taking fire. Lieutenant Harry Martin, platoon commander with 5th Marines, participated in final assaults that eliminated last organized resistance. We'd clear a cave, seal it with demolitions, move forward and take fire from the same cave hours later because Japanese had opened the seal or had alternate entrance, and we realized that we'd need to kill every defender because they wouldn't surrender, wouldn't stop fighting while they could still hold weapon, and this realization that we were fighting to extermination was psychologically difficult because we weren't killing enemy soldiers in fair fight, but were burning them alive in caves and burying them alive in tunnels, and this wasn't combat as we understood it, but was massacre, was necessary massacre because enemy refused to surrender, but was massacre nonetheless. The final statistics showed effectiveness of Kuribayashi's defense: 36 days of combat, 23,000 Japanese defenders, 21,000 Japanese killed, 3,000 captured or surrendered, though most captures were wounded soldiers who couldn't resist, and Japanese casualty rate of 98% meant Kuribayashi's orders against surrender were followed almost completely. Meant Japanese soldiers chose death over capture, meant cultural imperatives about honor exceeded survival instincts, and this absolute resistance made Iwo Jima unique among Pacific battles because on most islands thousands of Japanese soldiers surrendered or were captured, whereas on Iwo Jima surrender was essentially non-existent. American casualties for the battle totaled 26,000, 6,821 killed, 19,217 wounded, meaning American casualty rate was 37% while Japanese casualty rate was 98%, and the exchange ratio of approximately 1 American casualty for every 0.9 Japanese casualties was far worse than any previous Pacific battle, where typical ratio was 1 American casualty for 3 to 5 Japanese casualties, and this near parity in casualties proved Kuribayashi's defensive strategy had worked, had maximized American casualties, had achieved the 10-to-1 exchange ratio Kuribayashi had targeted. If calculated differently, each Japanese position killed 10 Americans before being destroyed. Kuribayashi's final fate remains uncertain. Official records state he died leading final attack on March 26. But his body was never identified, and some accounts suggest he committed suicide in his command post after sending final message, and the ambiguity about his death reflects the chaos of final days when Japanese command structure dissolved and individual soldiers fought independently until killed, and Kuribayashi's death, like his life, was dedicated to mission accomplishment rather than personal glory. March 26, 1945. 36 days after landing, and Marine Corps declared Iwo Jima secured, raised American flag in official ceremony, announced victory in battle that had cost 26,000 American casualties to defeat 23,000 Japanese defenders, and Major General Graves Erskine, commanding 3rd Marine Division, watched ceremony, understanding that secured was administrative designation rather than tactical reality because approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers remained alive in sealed caves and tunnels throughout the island, would continue sporadic attacks for weeks, would kill 50 more Americans after official victory declaration, and the gap between declared victory and actual pacification illustrated Iwo Jima's character, where nothing was truly finished, where Japanese resistance continued long after organized defense ended. The cost-benefit analysis was immediate and controversial. Iwo Jima had cost more American casualties than any previous Pacific battle, had consumed 3 elite Marine divisions for 5 weeks, had required strategic resources that couldn't be used elsewhere, and military analysts questioned whether 8 square kilometers of volcanic rock was worth 6,800 American dead. And the strategic justification was that Iwo Jima provided emergency landing field for damaged B-29 bombers returning from Japan and provided base for escort. Sergeant Strank, who'd survived Suribachi assault, was killed on March 1 during fighting in Central Highlands, was buried in 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima, and Strank's death 3 weeks before battle's end represented tragedy of Iwo Jima, where Marines who survived the most dangerous phases of battle died in later operations, where surviving one day didn't guarantee surviving the next because danger was continuous throughout 36 days, and Strank's Medal of Honor recommendation noted that he'd inspired his squad through example, had maintained discipline under fire, had embodied Marine Corps values of courage and leadership that made victory possible, though victory came too late to save him. Private First Class Hayes survived the battle, returned to America with other flag raisers, participated in bond tour that raised millions for war effort, but struggled with survivor guilt because 25 Marines from his company died on Iwo Jima while Hayes survived, and Hayes's post-war difficulties with alcoholism and depression characterized many Iwo Jima veterans who couldn't reconcile their survival with comrades' deaths, who felt that men who died were more deserving of survival, who carried psychological wounds that were invisible. but permanent. The immediate aftermath involved mopping up operations where Marines cleared remaining Japanese from caves. Small teams with flamethrowers and demolitions systematically sealed every cave entrance, used loudspeakers to demand surrender though few Japanese surrendered, dropped explosives into tunnel openings to collapse underground positions, and this brutal work continued for weeks after official victory because Marines couldn't leave island until satisfied that surviving Japanese couldn't threaten American air operations, and the mopping up phase killed approximately 1,500 more Japanese soldiers who refused surrender even after organized defense ended. Navy Seabees constructed 3 airfields on Iwo Jima while battle still raged, completed runways that allowed emergency landings before Marines declared victory, and the first B-29 emergency landing occurred March 4 when bomber damaged over Tokyo landed on Iwo Jima's partially completed runway, saving 11-man crew, and this landing validated strategic rationale for capturing Iwo Jima, validated the casualties Marines had suffered, provided tangible proof that Marine deaths had saved American lives even if exchange ratio was less favorable than hoped. April-May 1945. And American occupation forces on Iwo Jima continued encountering Japanese soldiers emerging from sealed caves, continued killing Japanese soldiers who attacked at night, continued clearing caves that contained living Japanese soldiers weeks after battle ended, and Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, commanding battalion assigned to occupation duty, understood that Kuribayashi's orders against surrender had created a situation where Japanese soldiers would fight literally forever unless killed. Where cultural imperatives about honor made survival unacceptable, where American forces would need to maintain combat readiness on Iwo Jima for months after declaring victory because enemy refused to acknowledge defeat. The few Japanese soldiers who surrendered told consistent story. They'd hidden in sealed caves with no food or water, had consumed stored supplies then eaten leather and paper, had watched comrades die from wounds or starvation or suicide, had eventually concluded that dying from thirst was worse than dishonor of surrender, and these surrender decisions were individual rather than command-authorized, were violations of orders that survivors justified through extreme circumstances, and American interrogators learned that Japanese soldiers viewed surrender as personal failure that brought shame to families and violated cultural codes that death in battle honored. Private Kiyomi Hirakawa, one of few Japanese survivors, was captured April 20 emerging from caves seeking water after 3 weeks sealed underground. My commanding officer ordered us to commit suicide rather than surrender, distributed grenades for this purpose. But I couldn't make myself pull the pin, watched as comrades killed themselves, listened as Americans sealed the cave entrance, survived on cave water and buried supplies, eventually realized I would die from thirst if I stayed, and chose surrender understanding that I dishonored myself and my family. But preferring life to honorable death, and this choice has haunted me for decades because I survived when better men died. The final Japanese surrender occurred December 1949. For years after the war ended, when 2 Japanese soldiers emerged from caves where they'd hidden, had survived on stored supplies and theft from American installations, had believed war continued because they'd had no communication with outside world, and these final survivors illustrated absolute dedication to resistance that Kuribayashi had instilled, illustrated cultural imperatives that made surrender unthinkable even when defeat was obvious, illustrated how completely Japanese military culture had convinced soldiers that survival through surrender was worse than death in combat. Total Japanese prisoners from Iwo Jima, approximately 3,000 of 23,000 defenders, representing 13% capture rate compared to typical 50% capture rate on other Pacific islands, and this low capture rate proved that Kuribayashi's no-surrender orders were followed, proved that Japanese soldiers chose death over capture, proved that cultural and military imperatives about honor exceeded survival instincts for vast majority of defenders, and this absolute resistance made Iwo Jima unique among Pacific battles in its near-total elimination of defending garrison. Today at Arlington National Cemetery, The Marine Corps War Memorial depicts the flag raising on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi, and the memorial's inscription reads, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue," and this phrase characterizes Iwo Jima, where 26,000 Marines became casualties over 36 days, where 27 Medals of Honor were awarded, more than any other single battle in American history, where courage was universal because survival required courage every moment, and the memorial honors not just the flag raisers, but the 6,800 Marines who died on Iwo Jima, the 19,000 who were wounded, the 50,000 who served and survived carrying physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The strategic debate continues. Was Iwo Jima worth its cost? Did emergency landings by B-29 bombers justify Marine casualties? Could strategic objectives have been achieved through different operational approaches? And historians remain divided, with some arguing that Iwo Jima was essential for supporting bomber operations against Japan, while others argue that casualties exceeded strategic value, that bypassing Iwo Jima would have achieved similar results at lower cost, that the battle represented last spasm of island-hopping campaign that atomic weapons would make obsolete within months. General Holland Smith, commanding Fleet Marine Force Pacific, wrote after the battle, "Iwo Jima was the most savage and costly battle in Marine Corps history. The fighting was fierce beyond anything we had experienced in the Pacific, and Japanese defensive tactics under General Kuribayashi were more effective than any previous enemy tactics. But Marines prevailed through courage and determination and adaptation, and victory proves that American fighting spirit combined with overwhelming firepower can overcome any defense, though victory at Iwo Jima came at a price that we hope never to pay again." The tactical lessons influenced American planning for invasion of Japan. Iwo Jima demonstrated that Japanese defenders using underground fortifications could inflict casualties approaching 1-to-1 exchange ratios. Extrapolating this to Japanese home islands suggested American casualties could reach 1 million for invasion of Honshu, and these projections influenced Truman's decision to use atomic weapons rather than conduct conventional invasion, influenced American strategy that sought Japanese surrender through overwhelming firepower rather than through ground combat that Iwo Jima proved would be catastrophically costly. Kuribayashi's defensive tactics became case study in military academies worldwide. His rejection of traditional Japanese tactics in favor of calculated attrition, his use of underground fortifications to survive American firepower, his discipline in preventing wasteful banzai charges, his understanding that prolonging battle and maximizing enemy casualties was more valuable than quick defeat. And these innovations showed that defenders using modern fortifications and fighting from prepared positions could achieve exchange ratios that conventional force ratios wouldn't predict, could make conquest prohibitively expensive even when defeat was inevitable. The final accounting: 23,000 Japanese defenders, 21,000 killed, 3,000 captured, 98% casualty rate. 70,000 American attackers, 26,000 casualties, 6,800 killed, 37% casualty rate. 36 days of combat for 8 square kilometers of volcanic rock. 1 American casualty for every 0.9 Japanese casualties, essentially 1-to-1 exchange ratio. That's Iwo Jima's legacy, proof that defense in depth using modern fortifications could inflict casualties that numerical superiority and firepower superiority couldn't prevent. Proof that tactical excellence could partially overcome strategic disadvantage. Proof that courage wasn't sufficient, that tactics and terrain and fortifications determine casualty rates as much as fighting spirit. General Kuribayashi calculated that each Japanese soldier should kill 10 Americans. The actual result was each Japanese soldier killed 1.1 Americans before dying. Kuribayashi's strategy worked, his defense maximized American casualties, his tactical innovations made Iwo Jima costliest battle in Marine Corps history. 26,000 American casualties prove that defending can be as deadly as attacking. That underground fortifications can survive modern firepower. That calculated attrition can achieve strategic effects that tactical victory cannot. 6,800 Marines died. They're why we remember Iwo Jima. They're why uncommon valor was a common virtue. They're why 36 days fighting 23,000 Japanese cost more American lives than 5 months fighting 130,000 Japanese at Okinawa. That's the mathematics of Iwo Jima, where tactics mattered more than numbers, where defense was deadlier than attack, where calculated attrition killed more effectively than traditional courage.